Hello, I am Daniel, and I'm a graphic designer in the board game industry. And Justin here has very kindly allowed me to take a look at some card designs that he's working on for a game that is called Void. It's a cooperative card game. And his plans long term are to sub-publish it, but right now the game is still in development, and we'll want to talk about some of the icons and whether the rules callouts are clear enough. Justin, can you tell me a little bit more specifics about what you wanted to talk about with this game?
Yeah, so I am an illustrator and I dabble in graphic design. So I hope that it's clear that I have some sense of aesthetic, but there is a level of polish as far as the visual communication is concerned that I thought it would be cool to reach out to someone who has greater experience, specifically making sure that the rules as they appear on the cards are understandable, not too symbolic, but definitely refer to the rules with the symbols. And that, as you can see, there are a number of different types of cards here. And I want to make sure that in trying to create a visually cohesive design that I haven't made it confusing, you know what I mean? To have the same sorts of callouts in similar positions, but on totally different kinds of cards. Would that be confusing to players? That sort of thing.
Right, right. Can you tell me a basic outline of how the game is played, how cards are used, how they're held in your hand, how they're seen on the table, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so you have a number of systems. The systems have resources which are replenished or depleted, and currently the systems cards are sort of a triptych of a one big scene that is spread across three cards. So when they're laid out, you can see the whole scene. The game involves a number of players. Each player has a crew card, which can be seen here, and draws a number of action cards, the card just above. And the action card has colored energy pips, and it can be discarded in order to get those pips in order to use their crew abilities or to operate functions of the ship systems. And what you're trying to do is basically get enough fuel to jump enough times to get home without the ship blowing up on
you. Naturally. And so have you been playtesting this and finding some ambiguities, things that come up a lot?
Yeah, so it's been pretty thoroughly playtested over the last 5 years. Before I had one that was more text-based, and as I began to refine the graphic design more, I focused through no small part, and thanks to your videos, on improving the graphic design and adding more visual interest to the icons. But I just want to make sure I haven't gone too far, make sure it still seems comprehensible to a player, that they don't have to sort of sit there and scratch their heads for a minute to sort of make sense of the symbols. I can't say that that's, but it's been my something I've been nervous about playtesting with the new art.
Sure, sure. I mean, you definitely have some cool looking art going on, and there is definitely that sense of polish that you described. I see you have an icon legend, and ideally you're thinking that this is going to be something that's set on the table in front of a player so they can refer back to this.
Yeah, presently it's on the back of the crew card, so you have your crew abilities on the front of the card that's given to you, and the icon legend is on the back. You can turn it over and read it or reference it.
I see. So just kind of running through this real quick, you draw a number of action cards as indicated. So the number that's on that green card is how many you will take into your hand.
Yeah.
And red is how many you discard. Discard a number of event cards as indicated by the icon.
Event cards is the challenging stuff that happens along the way.
All right. Discard one damage card. Draw one damage card. Okay. I'm seeing perhaps some ambiguities already, but let's go through this. Replenish indicate system. That means you untap it more or less, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, you flip one of the resource cards back to the replenish side.
Oh, right, because it's flipped, right? Okay. All right. And deplete indicated systems. And then you have some parameters for how and when abilities can be used. Those are fairly common. Only the active player may contribute. All players may contribute. Okay. And so as you start combining various icons, you kind of get a sense of what this means. So for example, let's say the This is it's not, is it an action card, would it be fair to describe it as?
It's a jump card, or yeah.
So in this case, um, I'm trying to read this. The override effect is something that everyone can do at the cost of these pips.
Yep.
And these three other icons, what do those represent?
Any color is permissible.
I see. Okay. And then you can flip this card to, or, well, what does a chain mean here?
So chain means that if a system goes into failure on the turn that this card is out, then you do whatever it says to do. So you would deplete all systems in that case.
I see. Okay. And continuous. You don't have an icon for continuous effects. No. Okay. All right. And so just an event thing here. So opportunity means that each player discards a damage card. I'm reading that right?
Yes.
Okay. But the cost to do that is that every player, any player who wants to do that effect must spend one red and two blues.
So yeah, anybody can pitch into playing it. If they do play it, then the effect occurs, which is each player draws a card, regardless of whether or not they pitched in.
Oh, okay. So one player could throw it all in, or everyone can share the load, or a little bit mix. Okay. I'm getting a better sense of that. Is that an effect that would occur? Okay. Before I get into the weeds, I want to go over a couple more of these. The event for debris field, danger, you deplete shields and command, and then tell me again what chain means again.
So if a system goes offline because of the above instructions, you do what the chain command says.
And in which case you would also deplete your fuel.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. All right. Making sense so far. Already got debris field. Was there another event that? The cascading failure, right? So now that I think of this, all right. So in order to override that continuous effect, so to be clear, that icon means any player would have to spend. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Getting a better sense of this now. Whoops. Sorry. And the shield systems, the function of the shields is that the active player can draw two cards, but in order to do so, they must spend a green pip and deplete the food.
So this is actually funny because I wanted to get this to you. This is kind of a newer design, and so it actually has the instructions for the greenhouse, not the shields on it, because I don't have the shields illustration done. But yes, each one would have a function of that would be called out on the card. Yeah.
Okay. And then once you've in order to so using the effect of the shield does not flip it over and deplete it. Is that correct?
Unless the function specifically says deplete the resource associated.
But if it does become depleted, then in order to replenish it, you'd have to spend 2 green pips or 4 blue pips.
Correct.
Who must spend that?
That would be any one player. It would be the player whose turn it is, unless there was some special ability.
All right, the active player. Have you thought about what's on the back of this card?
Yeah. So what happens is if a card instructs you to deplete a system that has no resources left, it goes into failure. You flip the card over, and the backside will have a repair cost and a negative thing that happens every turn unless you fix it.
Is there replenish cost on the back of the card as well?
No, you cannot replenish all the systems in failure.
Okay, so I may be a little bit confused then as far as depleting and replenishing. What physically happens to the card when it's depleted?
So you'll have 3 cards in a row. The depleted, the system itself, and then the replenished, and they'll be in a sort of a triptych, one after the other. And you'll flip one card to the other side of the system card and back to demonstrate it's been depleted or replenished.
And how is that different from being in a failure state or offline?
Right. So if all of the cards have been flipped to depleted, and an instruction tells you to deplete it again, you flip the system card over, and that'll have the failure.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. So just to kind of start things off here, um, how were these held in hand? Or do you hold a fan of cards, or are they laid out always in that triptych of tableau at all times?
So you always have your action cards in your hand. You can tell other players what you have, but you can't have them laid out in front of you just as a sort of a rule to facilitate communication. Like people can't sit in silence and stare at each other's cards. They have to tell each other what they have.
Okay. All
And
right.
those are the action cards.
These are the action cards. And so you would spend this card that gives you 2 green pips to use in various effects.
Correct.
All right. Okay. Is there any other information that would be on an action card?
Yes, occasionally some action cards will be special. They'll have a call out that'll allow you to discard it for a different effect and then getting the pips.
Oh, and you still gain the pips otherwise? Okay. And those are the only cards that you hold in your hand?
Yep. Damage cards as well. I didn't send you a copy of the damage card, but basically a damage card is just, it takes up 1 slot in your hand size. So when you draw your hand size, it takes up that much.
And you have a hand limit? Got it. Okay, cool. All right, cool. So you have your crew in front of you. You have 3 system cards in front of you, and they're kind of all lined up in a row.
Yeah, you'll have there's 6 systems. Each of them has 3 cards associated with it, and they're laid out in kind of a square pattern.
Okay. All righty. And if you have any images that you want to share in a screen share, please feel free. But I think I get a sense of this so far. Some really little like baseline recommendations. Let's go through the icon legend real quick. I see what you're doing with green being a good thing that happens, and red being a bad thing that happens. And I can see where that would make sense, generally speaking, because taking drawing cards into your hand is good, but taking a damage card is bad. And so you want to make the taking action of that diagram, that icon, very neutral, so that it doesn't get confused. That you don't want to imply that taking cards into your hand is always good, because sometimes it's not. Is that a fair assessment?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Okay. And discarding is not necessarily always bad, because discarding cards leads to certain actions. I'm assuming that the discard icon here is meant to represent like an additional cost to certain effects.
Yeah, or sometimes it'll be a penalty for an event card. It'll tell you to discard a certain number of cards, and you don't get any of the pips for having done so.
Ooh, okay, got it. Okay, so sometimes it's good, sometimes bad. And then the number just tells you that. So zooming in here a little bit. And you're using the sort of a splay of 2 gray cards here on the first 2 icons. Is that kind of representing your hand?
Yeah.
And you're splitting that splay on the damage icons to kind of indicate that it's kind of occupying a slot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. All right, makes sense. I mean, you're not too far off here. I think the only thing I'm not entirely certain that the reason why you have sorry, I'm just finding my words here. You have the third icon here that represents discarding a number of event cards as indicated by the icon, and you have this sort of like stack of very tiny stack of gray cards behind the purple card. Yeah. And you also have this like X across the purple card. Yeah. Is the X part of that meant to represent the discarding?
I honestly don't remember why I chose that.
Okay. That's
Yeah.
good. That's totally fine. um,
Yeah,
and and so you have this like stack behind them, which this is perhaps my own bias, but whenever I see a stack of cards, I think it's a deck, not a
yeah,
pile.
yeah.
Um,
That
and
would be
so
true. You would discard event cards off the top of the event deck.
okay. Um, oh, so this is leaving the deck directly. You're like milling the event deck.
Yes, and when you run out of event cards, you lose.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Okay. Um, hmm. Well, I think what's happening a little bit is that because you're presenting these icons rather small,
Mhm.
um, they they could be simpler in order to reduce the amount of visual information that you're having to process at once. And the simpler they are, the more succinct the visual language has to be. So in this case, you can use. I've said before in the past that red and green are colors to avoid for color blindness accessibility.
Mhm.
And in this case, you're not relying on it necessarily because you have other visual cues to represent what's happening. But that said, I still think that there are ways that you could make the icon simpler, but also increase the contrast that may be of some assistance. So what I would like to see, I'm curious about, is how these icons work without the gray cards on them, where you only have the colored card with an arrow up or down representing whether it's going towards you or away from you. Um, and in the case of the discarding an event card, um, because it's not necessarily going towards anybody, it's kind of a lateral move in some case. I think you could get by with just that purple card, but if you had a more substantial X feature to it that wasn't obscured by that circle, that might be a little bit clearer. The fact that you've incorporated the number into the icon as well is it can work. I've seen it work sometimes in say for example Race for the Galaxy. They incorporate a number into their draw icon, but I don't know how varied this mechanic might be. If it is if there's a lot of variables where you would want that number to be a little bit bigger, then you may find that it may be better for you to just have a discard or draw icon and then have a number separate beside that, just so you can get that number as large as possible. Right now, it's sort of confined into the shape that you have made available to it.
Yeah.
As for the contrast, to make these as distinct as possible, one way you could do that, potentially, not saying this is the best solution or anything, but in order to contrast these, imagining that these were in black and white, in your mind's eye, just imagine if these were black and white, you had no color perception at all. What are some ways that you could use to make these a little bit more distinct? And one way could potentially be that the draw icon is filled in, and you have a full flood of color with the number reversed out of it without that circle around it.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So if you have that card with a full flood of color with a white numeral inside of it, and then to contrast that, the other icon discarding would be like say all white with a dark numeral on top of that. So basically, the option is light on dark or dark on light, and which one of those is better than the other is to some extent subjective. It's when you are working on a visual system like this, a lot comes into repetition and getting people sort of accustomed to what language you're speaking as you do this. So there's not going to be necessarily a magic bullet that is 100% intuitive to everybody 100% of the time right off the bat. I wish there were. I wish there were like universal icons for a lot of stuff because it comes up a lot. So your job is to kind of balance what your game needs to do, and also what the precedents have been established by other games that your target audience might have played already, and kind of work around that. Sometimes respond to it, sometimes contradict those expectations if you find that your icons need to do other work that those icons don't do. Yeah, there's a couple things you could do. One mean, another thing you could do is like you could represent drawing cards as simply as a rectangle with a number on it, and then discarding with a card with an X over it and a number. But then you have this added complication that you have a separate category of card that you're discarding, and that also may be a second layer of meaning that might need to be a separate a separate icon. The fact that discard is an icon, but also event card is an icon. So you could just have an X or a trash can or a skull to represent cards go into a discard pile, and that represents that action. And then you have a separate thing that represents an action card or the event card or a damage card. And then you have these sort of two independent variables where the symbol that you're using to represent the act of throwing away a card is represented consistently by one thing all the time, and you don't have to relearn that with every single game effect. And then you also have a set of icons for your actions, your events, and your damage that could be on the corners of those cards as well, as an added reminder that this symbol means this type of card. And so when you see an effect that says star trash can, that means you're discarding an action card. And then a number beside that could be like star trash can 3 means you're throwing away 3 action cards. That's like that starts getting into a little bit more hieroglyphics a little bit. And that may not be as succinct as what you're going for. I can tell you want this kind of all represented as one icon or as little amount of space as possible, but just balance that desire with clarity too, and see where some compromises may or may not need to be made. The other stuff, the replenish and deplete. My first thought when you had a gear here is that gears turn, they don't flip. And that's just a metaphorical thing, but it's something you kind of have to get over. If you want to keep that icon, you're going to get some expectations that this is tapping, because quite often gear symbols in other games are used to represent tapping and rotating cards rather than like flipping them over. And this could be solved simply by just showing an icon showing an arrow icon that has a little bit of 3-dimensional depth to it, where you kind of show the arrow flipping over to one direction or the other. The tricky part of that is, of course, the making sure that you're consistent about left to right or right to left, because you could flip them in either direction and like it means one or the other. So it's not exactly a very clear separate difference between those two icons. What you may find is that you need a symbol for the active state or the replenished state, and a symbol for the depletion state or failed state, and those also be on the cards, system cards as well in front of you, so that it's just right off the bat you could still even keep the arrow exactly in the state that you have it right now, but with the active or replenished icon as needed, or the depleted side or failed side icon as needed, rather than using the gear.
That's a good idea.
As you start working on this, you have a fair number of icons, and just going down the list, you have the right instinct in the following group of icons with hourglasses as a unifying frame for a set of effects that have they're part of a family. They're kind of communicating very similar things. In this case, when the effect may be used. And so an hourglass is just as good a symbol as anything. And just kind of tapping back up here, I think you have the right idea for a gear to represent a mechanical thing, the state of whether a machine is functional. And that's an entirely valid metaphor to work with. And you can even keep that shape of the outer gear frame as your replenished or depleted state, and have a different icon within that frame. So you just fill in that gear you don't have a little hole in it, but instead you have some other symbol that is just within that gear. But on a similar token, or similar note, I should be clear about my game terms. A similar note, rectangles typically mean cards. So if you have some kind of icon representing a card effect, then rectangles do the trick. And to some extent, you have kind of obfuscated it a little bit by cutting off that card and making a parallelogram. And it looks cool, and it definitely fits the aesthetic, the dynamic angles that you have on the rest of your card design. But if this is something that I'm looking at the game state and I need to see it at a glance, and possibly upside down, for example, that may be something where you have to sacrifice some of that cool factor in order to just make it as clear as possible. And the last two icons are fairly clear. I mean, that's just straight up classic. If you have any variations on this where the active player may not use it, or some other thing like that, you can easily vary that icon system by shading out the middle figure in that group, for example. And like, there's a lot of variations you can do with that. Classic solution, it works, and I don't see a need to necessarily complicate that any further. Before I go like any deeper on this, do you have any questions? Anything that's come up? What's on your mind?
I found this very valuable so far. I think it is interesting to consider how I could simplify the icons down further. And it's interesting because each of the colored pips from the action deck, they're all the same symbol, but they're turned different ways because I explicitly wanted to have the game be more colorblind accessible. So like, even if you couldn't tell the color at all, you could look at, like, it's pointing down, it's pointing up, it's pointing right or left. Right. But then I didn't think at all about the red green as far as the other icons are concerned.
Well, in this case, I'm not. That was the other thing I want to talk about when we get to it. But is there anything else that you want to bring up before we move on to the pips?
I think I'd like to move on, yeah.
Okay. It's not just the color accessibility that you have to be concerned with, but it's also orientation around a table. Some players are going to be looking at this upside down, and in dim light, or if they're like, if they don't have the contacts in, or what have you, the fact that all of the pips are circles within circles at different rotations is not necessarily going to be the clearest way to differentiate those pips from each other. Because the green one looks like a red one if you look at it upside down and you don't have great color perception to begin with.
You gotta flip that from your cards to thing and back, yeah. Right.
So it's a cool idea, and if these icons were bigger, then you could vary things up with some line patterns inside of those color fields. Straight lines, zigzag lines, polka dots, do some variations there. But at this scale, I think the simpler solution might be coming up with some thematic name for each of these pips that contributes to the resource that you're spending.
Yeah, they have themes.
What are they?
Green cards have to do with like sort of labor and effort. Blue is like technical acumen. Red is heroism or bravery, and purple is like genius or like inspiration.
Oh, okay. So I think in that case, yeah, you probably want to keep these. You can even keep the colors. You can keep the circles, but the outer circles, that is. But I would recommend that you inset a reversed out icon representing the theme of what these resources are that you're spending. For one thing, it adds a nice touch of flavor to it, to know that I'm not just spending red or heroism or sorry, not just spending red, but I'm being heroic as I do a thing. I take it from Cascading Failure here. I'm imagining the scene of Spock sacrificing himself to turn off the reactor, and so it's like an act of heroism, but it's also a little bit of engineering, like self-sacrifice. There's a story implied when you can get a little bit more of that into the icons themselves. and that may help as well. In terms of the neutral pips that you have here, you may also be better off just making those just gray circles, simplifying those, and again implying that these are just placeholders that you just need to drop anything into those slots, and you're good. It'll be easier to recognize that contrast from a distance by just having a solid circle on a white background. And so in this case, so what were the pips representing again?
So green is effort or labor, and blue would be technique or technical knowledge.
So I need to bring up the shields. It's going to be so many hours of work or so much technical acumen to get it done.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Yeah. I mean, the story comes together when you start talking about it in those terms.
Yeah.
Overall layout stuff. I think for some effects, if the cost of this effect is a prerequisite to the effect, then that cost should be above the effect. I feel anyway that so because right now it looks like I can do that effect and then pay it rather than paying up front.
Gotcha.
And then doing the effect. There are some contradictions to that though, because it looks like in some cases you do want the effect to come first. In this case, you want this failure state to trigger first, and then you say to the players, okay, this is what's happening, but you can stop it if you pay this. Whereas for the effects on flight rest, you're saying, hey, if you pay this, then you get this. And the order of those things is subtle, but it helps with the overall syntax that you're establishing for all of these cards. What is the icon here on the bottom left corner with the 6 and the fan of cards on it?
Yeah, so you have a hand limit that changes each turn. The active player has a hand limit based on the event card or jump card which is drawn. So in the case of drawing that card, you have the ability to draw up to 6 cards.
Understood. Okay, yeah, makes sense. That's big. It's I presume fairly easy to see from a distance. You'd have to be careful with your artwork to make sure that corner of the card is always dark and doesn't have a lot of high contrast patterns behind it, so that it's always clear. Something to be cautious about. I do like the ambitious nature of how you've tried to lay out these cards. It's very gutsy to try to get full flood artwork and then overlay text on it. It's tricky. I've tried it before, and it's sometimes tricky because in many cases you find that you have to compromise either the readability or the aesthetics. And in my case, I always favor the readability, because if they can't read the card, then they can't play the game. But if you're an illustrator, that's an awkward position to put yourself into, because you put so much labor into the artwork that you don't want to have to make that choice. So
make those changes on the fly fairly easy.
Okay.
Myself, so I can alter I can try to balance that, I think, with a little bit more fine tuning than maybe a designer could who was talking to an illustrator back and forth.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Just making sure that you're aware of that challenge.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that, and that's a big part of kind of why I was keen to get your advice on this, because I want to make sure I have the right balance of readability and also even if you can read it, like legibility, the amount of text versus symbols. Am I trying to communicate too much stuff in symbols, or does it seem to work?
I mean, I've seen more ambitious attempts at iconifying game effects, so you're not completely off track here. I will say that it's some of the text, say when you have to go to 2 lines within that same thin bar, that text does get a little bit small. So the solution there would be to either this goes into editing and sort of a text style choice for your game. And there's volumes that you could write on the nature of, say, how Magic the Gathering has established their templating structures of how they phrase certain effects and all that. But independent of all that, what you could do is theoretically just shorten how the text is phrased. And you've done a little bit of that by just sort of using a label with food on it to represent that system. And you've actually done that also here as well with all systems. And so you've established a language already that if this is a white bold word on a gray rounded rectangle, then that refers to a system by that name, whether it's all systems or the food or shields or what have you. And you're so you could theoretically just lean into that a little bit more.
What if there were a case where, and I can't remember if I actually have kept any cards that had sufficient or weird enough rules, but what if there were a case where I felt like I needed more text? How would you suggest I go about accommodating that?
For me, I would recommend always keeping your text size consistent across the deck as long as possible. And in some cases, in this case in particular, I would have recommended that you just increase the height of that text field so that you can accommodate 2 lines here. As a result, that means that your line breaks are going to be at different places, and it may result in actually 3 lines rather than 2 because of the width of the text field you've established for yourself. And so you may find that as you go through that process that this right-aligned structure that you have on the card layout may not be as versatile as you need it to be in order to do everything you need it to do. And this is a very common thing to occur when you're doing card layout. Very often you find that, oh, I've laid out one card, it looks great, but the solution to lay out that card does not apply equally to the entire deck. And so you kind of have to like see the entire forest and solve for the entire forest, even if an individual tree doesn't look as great as you would hope. That's sort of the nature of the beast, unfortunately. But to solve some of this, you may find that it's easier to just extend the text fields all the way across the full width of the card and align your preface, your inline header. So in this case, continuous or override all players, or in the function. Right now, it's the left edge is starting at different points, which typically would mean that it's that kind of ragged left edge makes it a little bit harder to get your bearings if this were a longer piece of text. Because these are so short, I think you can flex a little bit. You don't have to be so rigid to that. But if you find that over the course of your entire deck that you're running into an issue where the amount of space that you need is not as flexible as you would like, you may need a stronger skeleton where you're left aligned instead of being sort of ragged. And so you have a consistent axis where your text begins for the title of an effect or the function of an effect, and the actual effect itself. There's a couple ways you could do that. I like just visualizing this a little bit. This is an old typographic trick, but if you were to take this card, for example, and you just took a ruler and you put it over your screen, over the card, and you start sort of moving that ruler from left edge to right edge, how many times does that ruler start a new block of text? And if the number of times is fairly frequent, then it might serve to make your text look a little bit more organized if you reduce the number of like starting points for your text. The extreme version of this would be to have everything lined up to the perfect edge, left edge of your card. You don't necessarily need to do that. Right? For example, in shields, that would result in a fairly large amount of open negative space on the right top right corner because that word is so short. So that is one case where you could align that to the center and be good, but you may find that the effects, the function, the replenish, that could be a place where you use a more rigid structure for your typography. This is typically called a typographic grid. And it's a useful tool to organize your text. And so if you're looking up more info about this sort of thing, just look up typographic grids, and so you'll see some examples from like classic type layout and solutions that hundreds of years of designers have explored and tried to solve. For what it's worth, the replenished and depletion. Depleted sides of the cards. Those are places where you could. It doesn't look like there's a lot of information that you need to have on those sides of the card, so you don't need to be so constrained here. It looks like you reserve some space for some other card effects, but I don't know if that's the case. But you could make that replenished and depleted much bigger if you wanted it. If you wanted it to be, you can play around a little bit more. Before I forget about it, you did mention whether you're concerned that some of the cards might look a little bit too similar, like the event card versus the action card.
Yeah, all the callouts are more or less the same on the crew card versus the systems cards versus the jump and event cards. And I wasn't sure if that was going to be confusing to a player to sort of see all of the. Would that be helpful to the player to know that all of the things that interact with their hand kind of look the same, or will it be confusing because the crew callouts have some different symbols, but they have the same frame as the event consequences?
Well, I think in some cases there's a couple ways that you can communicate differences between types of cards without even going into the colors or anything like that. The biggest one is orientation. So if in the case of your event cards, they never go into anybody's hand. And they're relevant for everybody to see whenever they come out. You may find that doing a horizontal layout to make them a little bit more cinematic, almost, would be worthwhile, and that would certainly distinguish that type of card from the rest, because none of the other cards are horizontal. I'm not saying that that's the best solution, but that's one way to do it. I've seen other games use that same solution whenever they have cards that are meant to be laid out like tiles, to again emphasize that because it's awkward to hold it in your hand, it reinforces the fact that it's not supposed to be in your hand in the first place. So this is something called an affordance. You'll see affordances. The term affordance used in places like on door handles, when it's a push or a pull door handle. If it's just a plate, then that is obviously an affordance that says you can push this door, but you can't pull it. And by the same token, when you turn a card horizontal, you're saying this is a place card, not a hand card. It's a small thing, but for me,
I think I remember something about that from a product design course, like a 101 I took. I think I remember something about that.
Yeah. It's none of this is big taking stuff. This is like you're in good company is what I mean. You're trying to solve problems that a lot of designers have come up with, and lucky you, there are solutions. So that you have good news. Regarding the crew cards, same token. I think you might be better off aligning these lines of text to one axis. Whether that means that they flood across the entire card, that's up to you. But I certainly think aligning those A's, advantage, ability, like there's a certain rhythm to that I think would help to make the text a little bit easier to parse right off the bat, especially if every player has a different crew card. Same deal here too. If you want to make that text a little bit bigger, you may find that you have to make that strip a little bit taller. The hourglass icons, now that when I'm looking at them closely in context, those are fairly large, and that's good, so you can read them at a glance easily. But there's also quite a few lines. Like you have, just counting the lines from outside to inside, you have a dark line that frames the hourglass. Then you have the white sort of outer edge of that hourglass to represent the sort of the glass part of it. And then you have a dark line to separate that hourglass from your secondary icon. Then you have a white outline within that to further frame your secondary icon. And then you actually have the actual fill of the icon itself. So if you're going to explore refining that, my recommendation would be to see how you can use fewer concentric borders. See how simple and how minimal you can make that icon and still make it clearly red. I suspect you can remove one or two of those, but I can't say for sure. That's going to be up to you to explore. What else? Oh, yes, back to the distinguishing the cards. I would recommend at least trying to have different borders for your events, for your action cards, for your system cards, and those colors might overlap with your pips, and that is a hazard that you may run into with pretty much any game, really. There's only so many colors that are visible to the human eye, so that's yet another reason why having distinct icons and framing devices for the pips would be useful in that case, because if it's in a circle, then it's always clear that this is a pip or an action, and you can use that as a sort of a suit icon to put onto the respective action cards, so that regardless of whatever the color of the border is on an action card, you always know what that action card is actually meant to do. I mean, who knows? If you wanted to, you could make the crew card horizontal. I'm assuming the crew card is not ever put in your hand.
No, it's laid in front of you, yeah.
Personally, I would love to see this, even though it would result in the art being a little bit smaller, I would love to see this art less obstructed, and put sort of off to the side so that you have the full half card or a third of a card to devote to your crew effects. In which case, you might stack advantage and then the effect ability and then the effect and then ability and another effect, rather than having them be a full line.
Yeah.
And in which case, the reason I bring that up is that if you have action cards that follow this sort of same structure, then you have a natural tie-in that this is my character and these are the things that my character does, so that you have this continuity between a player's sense of identity and how they can interact with this game world. That gets very fluffy and metaphorical. My apologies if I drift there a little bit. It's a bad habit, but it's the kind of thing you have to think about. So, because right now you have this flood of neutral gray on the depleted and replenished things, but the crew is never depleted or replenished. It's machines that are, or systems that are. And so things that tie the states of machines with the machines would be useful, so that again those things kind of match up together and you have a sense of continuity. Other ways that you can tie cards of a single deck together is exploring how you have reversed or not reversed text. To be specific, by reversing I mean light on dark or dark on light. The method by which you displayed the text on a background. In this case, you've varied the angle that you're showing those titles, but I don't know if that is a sufficient distinction that would communicate this. So that takes us to about 50 minutes. Before we wrap up, do you have any questions, long-term stuff? I've dumped a lot on you, so my apologies. I tend to go on. But do you have any questions you have?
I was wondering, as to your opinion, I don't know if it's going to be something that comes across just looking at each individual card by itself. I wonder if I could share the screen or share screen something.
Let's try.
But I'm one of the things that I've been trying to do as I'm moving to like this sort of more refined stages is think about how I can I'm going to use some old art so that I don't, because I briefly used some art that was not mine
Oh,
before I
sure.
started stuff, and I don't want to put like copyrighted images on your videos. How do you share the screen?
It's okay.
I don't know. Is that right? Can you see my screen now?
It hasn't come up yet. Oh, there it goes.
So yeah, showing you the old art probably isn't
Hmm.
helpful. But this is how the game is laid out, and I've been thinking a lot about how to imply to the player how the game is put together without them reading the book or the rules first. And so that's kind of why I decided to have the like full triptych card art and like different frames for the different systems so that they kind of fit together like a puzzle piece, and you can see the whole tableau how like it doesn't fit together in the right way unless you put it in the correct order. I was just curious if you had opinions about that or advice on that. I know it's kind of hard without being able to see all the current art in place, but
Would the artwork be a panorama that extends across all three cards?
yeah.
Okay.
And
That
just generally, like, what are good best practices for trying to communicate? I mean, this is a silly question because there's a lot of them, I'm sure. But as far as communicating how to play or how to set up the game, if you have any advice given what you've seen here today.
honestly, the best example I've seen of this that most people would be familiar with is the game Tokaido. That has actually three separate panoramas that you assemble over the course of the game. And in one of them, there are a triptych, and the other is like a four-piece, and the other one's a five-piece. And that has way less information represented on those panoramas. So it's not 100% one-to-one matchup, but um, I think the fact that you've already planned for the artwork to span across those three cards is a huge step forward. What I would recommend is if you have is one card meant to be in the middle and one card meant to be on the left and one card meant to be on the right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
In that case, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, in the case of the shields, if you look at my screen where it says
Yeah.
whole, so that would be
Yes.
where the central card would be, and then either the replenished and depleted cards would be on either side of that, and each system would be like that with full triptych across all three.
Yeah, I think one easy way to do this is to have an arcing border that sort of curves across the entire triptych.
Mhm.
Um, but the trick there is that you have very specific um, depleted or replenished cards for each system. So I don't know if you want to if you have the same curved border on on all of them, then you don't necessarily like they're not meant to be mixed and matched. I'm assuming. Um, so that's another place for having distinct textures or colors or border effects that tie those cards together distinctly. It's what you're going to come across a lot is the challenge of variation versus stability, and which
Mhm.
elements you keep stable, which elements you make more varied. Um, and in this case, I think you could afford to have a continuous border shape that is the same for all of your systems, as
Mhm.
long as the texture or color that you have, the pattern. In this case, what you have is sort of a triangle grid with this star field effect superimposed over it.
Yeah.
That's a cool effect, and that's totally fine for one of the systems. But I would recommend, say for example, that would work for your fuel or your shields maybe. But I would think that for your water cycle system, you'd want to have a more watery texture back there. For your oxygen, you may want to have I'm not sure, clouds, uh, mist, some other effects. Food typically would be leaves or vines. It's tricky with a sci-fi setting because you can't lean on the tropes that would normally be handy in a modern or even a fantasy setting because you want to look futuristic. So I would recommend explore resources like a stock photo site like Shutterstock, and see what vector assets are available there for relatively affordable rates, and see if you have some shortcuts that you can use for the time being. I wouldn't recommend necessarily like spending a whole bunch on this, and in fact, you could find some fairly nice abstract backgrounds if you're looking at resources like somewhere where you can get free phone wallpapers. That I've seen some surprisingly decent prototype cards set up with that kind of pattern in the background, just for the purpose of testing and distinction. But yeah.
So
Yes.
what do you? I don't want to keep you too much longer, as I know you're already giving me plenty of time. So just one final question. I was thinking of having each of the systems have a variation on the bordering, such that they like interlocked as a puzzle when put together. The borders would sort of all cohere. Do you think that would be a decent idea, or do you think it would be too weird to have them all have different border shapes?
So when you say all together, do you mean just those three, or all of all 12 of these cards?
Yeah, so there'll be like there'll be a border for shields, and then fuel or engines, which is next to it, will have a border which seems to continue on from that from shields beside it and oxygen above it, so that all six of them kind of cohere into a puzzle, sort of. And exist in relation to one another.
If you are very if that is specifically the order that you want the cards to be laid out, then any graphical element that you do that suggests this, the interlocking nature of it, is useful. I did something like this on a game called Xenon Profiteer. That's Xenon Profiteer. It's a game about processing air and extracting the element xenon out of it. It's a noble gas, and so the gameplay was sort of a deck builder where you laid out all the piping in the factory, and there was some specific overlaps where a pipe would extend from one edge of the card to another. And so you could do something like that. Say the card on top has a little section of pipe on the bottom, and then you have the card that's meant to be below that have a little section of pipe above it, but you don't have a section of pipe on the bottom of the second card, because that would imply that it goes the other way. So it doesn't necessarily need to be frames. It could be other elements that are fairly subtle but distinct enough that it's very clear the order in which these cards are laid out. Just be careful that they don't get too jumbled. They could be fairly subtle connections, but what I would say is that if you do specifically have an order to the grid in mind, then any element that helps that is good.
Awesome.
Cool.
You've given me a lot to consider.
Well, I hope it's helpful. Thank you very much for letting me record this.
Thank you for having me on.
All right. So your game is, you want to give a spiel of your game again, just for anybody who's interested in following it?
It's called Void. You can follow me on, there's no like official anything for it yet, but you can follow me on Twitter if you wanted to. I think I'm at Justin Nichol.
Can you spell that?
JustinNichol.
Great. Cool.
Cool. Thanks so
much. All right. Thank you so much, and good luck, and hopefully we can talk again.
Yeah, I'll send you my solutions when I come up with them, so maybe you can see inspired.
Sweet. All right. Well, take care. Good luck.